Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Old Hunt, where we are still celebrating 10 years of Bloodborne. We are playing through version 1.00 of the Japanese release, and last time, it was another one of those episodes where we were largely focused on lore. We talked a good deal about the notes that we can find in the second floor of the lecture building, also managed to run into the strange being that misled us earlier on this night of the hunt, discovered that they're a person with a spider body, or a spider with a human head. Not exactly sure what the nature of that particular creature is. Kind of strange, hard to figure out, much like a lot of other things in Bloodborne. And then, of course, we opened with what I've been doing lately, review of some comments and ideas that people had brought up as they're watching along with the playthrough. And so I'd like to open once again with that same set of ideas, beginning with Bigubosu, who had left a comment. Really three things that I want to address, two of which are relatively straightforward, I think, pretty simple, but that I thought were kind of cool. So first of all, Bigubosu drew a connection between some of the notes that I personally had never seen drawn before, and so I thought that was kind of fun. And also, I'm recognizing as I have this point, foremost in my mind, like I talked about how Nasakenai Shinka, or pathetic evolution, gives sort of a wider possibility space, but I didn't necessarily go into what that wider space might entail. And I think probably, again, I'm not entirely sure about this because I don't have a very strongly formed theory of my own surrounding this particular aspect of Bloodborne, but I think the idea is that if you're talking about sort of pathetic evolution or maybe degenerate evolution, might be another way to think of it, right? Because Nasakenai, just a sort of relatively broad term, right? But if we think of it as degenerate, it gets you that sort of negative association, but it also brings to mind the idea of bestial transformation in particular, right? It's as if the person who's writing that note doesn't views bestial transformation as a step backwards, when what they really want is ascension, right? They want to go up towards the great ones. They want to elevate their beings and thoughts to the next level. That's sort of their real goal. And so they see the succumbing of humanity to beasthood as the end of our race, right? The ruin of our race. And that makes a certain amount of sense to me. But I specifically like, because like I said, the take of without courage, evolution without courage for Nasakenai Shinka, that's not ruled out by the Japanese because the Japanese is fairly broad. And the thing that I liked about Bigubosa's comment is there's another note that we can find in the research hall. Talks about, it's very straightforward, hunt the great ones, hunt the great ones. Well, if you think about it, you sort of need to not have any fear of the great ones if you want to evolve in their direction, right? So maybe we can tie these sort of notes together, right? And if you think about the way that the great ones have fairly consistently been depicted in Yharnam society, right? There's a lot of treatment of them as gods. You can think of the Tomb of the Gods again, right? And I know I brought this up relatively recently, where I was focusing on tomb, because we're thinking about death as a transitional state. And therefore we have the idea of great ones who have died, but at the same time have ascended. But at the same time, they're also known as gods, right? And you walk into the Grand Cathedral, and both sides are lined with the Amygdala statues. Amygdala's a great one. They seem to be worshipped as gods. I didn't get this particular line from Patches, because again, I chose the other dialogue option that's a little bit more natural to me, but that didn't include the full reasoning that I was sort of hoping to display. But one of the things he will say to you is, consider you were as a lamb to my God, right? Or something along those lines. The important phrase, right? You were as a lamb to my God. That idea of Amygdala as his God, right? As a being that is above him, that is greater than him. He can't conceive of us defeating that being. We were offered as a sacrifice, really, even though we were enticed into it with the promise of arcane knowledge and power for ourselves. The intention seems to have been that we would be sacrificed to Amygdala. All of that really reinforces this idea of the great ones as gods, as things better and above us. But if you think of them that way, if you hold them in awe, you'll never be on their level. You need to conceive of them as equals. You need to conceive of them as targets for a hunt, as even beneath you, right? As your prey. And maybe that's part of the path forward, is if you stop thinking of them as gods, as beings that you need to be in awe of, and move towards them. So hunt the great ones, let's not be daunted, right? Evolution without courage will be the ruin of our race, right? So you sort of tie those two notes together in this idea of ascending to a higher level of being. And I've never really come across that interpretation before. I'm sure it's out there, but I've never come across it. So I thought that was kind of cool. I wanted to share that idea. Also, just a visual note. I had drawn the connection in the previous episode between the like skull wall type formations that we can see in the Nightmare of Mensis and the potential sacrifices, the victims maybe, of the Mensis ritual. Very unclear what's exactly going on with the Mensis ritual and how separate the two rituals are and what's, where and what and important to which things. But Big Goob also did note that there seems to be some visual continuity between those skull faces forming rock walls and the cramped casket enemies, which I'd never drawn that parallel, despite, both of them potentially being tied to the sacrifices or whatever the fate was of those people who got caught up in one or the other of these rituals that are happening on the night of the hunt. So I thought that was an interesting idea, wanted to bring that up myself. And then finally, another thing that Big Goob brought up that I thought was fascinating, not 100% sure where I land on this, but I wanted to bring it up. And the idea is that the doll here, who has some sleeping dialogue in the Japanese, you can sort of hear her snoring, but we have the doll here as a unique being. And I don't want to get too far away from Big Goob wording, because I'm like, there's a bunch of different ways that you can take this. So I'm going to do a little bit of summary, but also try and capture Big Goob words here. Pale blood is such a specific term, and no being in the game bleeds a pale color except for the doll, not even Flora, right? And if you remember, this is the playthrough where I did go through and demonstrate that you can strike at the doll, and she does bleed a weird color, and you can kill the doll, sort of, and a new consciousness arises in the old one's place. She doesn't seem to be aware of anything. She greets you as if it's the first time you've ever interacted with her. So she has this weird nature that's maybe tied to what's going on with Flora, the Great One. Because here's the thing, I don't want to get too far into analyzing things that you're never going to see in this playthrough, but to a certain extent, I feel like this is almost inevitable at this point. So I'm going to get a little into it, right? Because if you actually do go and face the Moon Presence, you can note a few unique things about its moveset, right? It has a move that can reduce you to 1 HP. And what does your HP represent? It represents your willpower, right? What are blood echoes? They're the bequeathed wills of the dead, right? Wishes from the slain that are manipulated into our being. And then something else the Moon Presence can do? Shut off healing. Well, what's associated with healing? Blood, right? And the invigorating feeling that I've speculated in this playthrough might be tied to blood echoes in and of itself. So it does sort of seem like the Moon Presence has the ability to manipulate blood and blood echoes, right? So does the doll. Manifestly, the doll is the only thing that we know 100% can manipulate blood echoes, right? And, again, as Big Goob is pointing out, bleeds a pale color. She, the doll, is an undying mamono, right? Mamono, I've talked before, a very broad term, all right? We can think of it as a monster, but we could also think of it just as a magic being. And certainly we can't fully understand the nature of the doll. She's this monstrosity, back to Big Goob words, monstrosity that should not exist, but has a life of her own, and a being that defies reality, capable of using blood for a higher purpose beyond getting drunk. To transcend the hunt, we need to become stronger, and so we seek her assistance. And then Big Goob goes to point out that the third umbilical cords, right, being called umbilical cords, seem to have some tie with the idea of nourishment. And I've sort of maybe speculated, right, because if you go to the, opening of the third umbilical cord description, which we've got to go there for, several reasons anyway, so I'll bring it up here, this one in particular. But we know that, right, these are known also as cords of the eye, right? They're not necessarily umbilical cords, they can also be conceived of as cords of the eye. So they might also be like this optic nerve for the third eye, but maybe part of their purpose is to take in information or energy that needs to be processed this way in order to have the higher level thoughts that one would wish for from a great one. Again, it's not 100% clear, but every infant great one has one of these, and that's where the idea of an umbilical cord comes from, right? So there is possibly some tie to the idea of nourishment, and then Bigubosu points out that if you use these third umbilical cords and you get like the most secret ending, the doll sort of ends up playing a role of mother, and the doll like may or may not have a strong consciousness of her own, right? Because we've seen that sort of reintroduction of consciousness in this playthrough. And so it's possible that the moon presence is almost puppeteering the doll, is providing her with some seed of consciousness, and also providing her with the powers to manipulate blood echoes? Maybe? And like, I know there are theories out there that put the doll like right at the center, like as the chief great one involved in everything that happens in this game. I personally have never been a huge fan of that story, but it is interesting. And it's not like I have a better one, right? I mean, you do get more information about the doll being tied to Maria in the DLC, and, you know, that possibly inspiring the creation of the real world doll. And we know that the dream version of the doll has something to do with the way that Gehrman saw Maria, it seems like. Again, there's a little bit of interpretation that's going into my statement there. But as for the ultimate nature of the doll's being, that still remains a mystery in every version of the game. So if you prefer to look at the doll as sort of being the one that's in charge of everything, like, I do think you can make that work. Like I just said, I'm just not the biggest fan of it myself. But I also wanted to bring this up, right? Because first of all, I just wanted to thank Bigubosu for the thought. I think that's a very good way of getting at the idea of the centrality of the doll, right? So no matter what role you think she ends up playing, right? She might just be as subservient as she seems and happens to play a very central role while being very humble about it. Or she might actually be a huge deal and it's just secretive, right? I could see, various takes on this. But I wanted to bring that out because I think Bigubosu found a particularly interesting way to tie together some of those connections. Going off the idea of the moon presence's ability, though, this brings me to a different comment by Rune Esper. And I really liked this idea that Rune Esper brings up of Flora consuming blood echoes, stripping the blood of its vitality, and leaving it pale. Because I think this ties in pretty well with that note, right? Behold a pale blood sky. Well, what do we know from the director's comments on that particular note? We know that the pale blood sky, right? Pale blood as a color, right? This sort of pale blue, reminiscent of a corpse that's been drained of blood. So we associate paleness with the loss of vitality, right? So how do you get pale blood? You get blood that's been drained of its vitality, of its vital power. What could be infusing the blood with its vital power? Blood echoes, right? Because we've seen that that's sort of the persistent aspect of a person that can infuse blood, right? That's sort of the whole idea of the dying will of blood, right? Is that the dying wills are the representations of the people as they die, and they, some of them at least, adhere within the blood as a medium. And we can take them in and weave them into our being. And the idea of the moon presence potentially being able to manipulate these things, it does sort of seem like the moon presence has some sort of tie to blood and maybe even blood echoes. And I like that idea, particularly because of the association with paleness. Now, there was some back and forth in the comments afterwards about sort of Flora's end goal and whether it's just to consume blood echoes or if it's tied more in with the idea of seeking a child. And it's a little bit unclear, right, what exactly is going on there. And you can, of course, as always, check out the comments for yourselves if you want to take a look at the ideas that are being exchanged back and forth, get in on the conversation, right? I'm not going to get too into that because, again, it involves elements of the game that we're not necessarily going to get to. And even what I am going to say is going to continue to get a little bit into some information that we don't get. But I want to focus back on the past, because this is also going to take me around to the thing that I said in the previous episode. I mentioned I wanted to come back to an idea about that note about Lawrence and his associates. Because if we tie that in with some information that we get on this third umbilical cord, I think we get an interesting picture. And this is going to sort of justify what I was saying before, right? When I mentioned how Gehrman is someone that we can associate with Lawrence, right? Lawrence and his associates, one of them at least seems to be Gehrman. And there's a pretty strong tie here, even though it's kind of roundabout, right? And it involves, again, this is why I'm still on the screen, the third umbilical cord. So we, at the very final section here, right, we learn that every Great One loses a child, or its child, or it's a little bit unclear because of the nature of Japanese grammar. Every Great One loses a child and seeks, right? And then seeking has this idea of yearning almost baked into it with the motometeiru in the Japanese. So the idea of it yearning for a replacement or a surrogate, right? These are various translations, sort of gets at that yearning, right? And it also ties in with the statement that we get from the director Hidetaka Miyazaki about how infants that are treated as special can serve as lures for the Great Ones. They're attracted to them because they all lose their children at one point or another. So they're drawn to these special babies. Well, that seems to be something that's going on here, right? Because we have the first line in the final section of this. And again, right, the different versions of the game have slightly different versions of this text, but all of the text that I'm going to talk about in this point is present still in version 1.09, right? Every Great One loses a child and seeks. Therefore, this brought about the encounter with the pale moon. So this presumably is being used to reference the third umbilical cord, right? This particular item, right? It's not just this random thing, right? This is the classic Bloodborne referent problem, but I think you can pretty straightforwardly tie it to the third umbilical cord. So this third umbilical cord brought about an encounter with the pale moon. And now that we know that pale blood is the term that was used by Lawrence and his associates to refer to the moon presence, and the moon presence can be found here in the Hunter's Dream, it certainly sounds like this third umbilical cord was used to bring about an encounter with the moon presence. Now, it is the pale moon and not pale blood, right? The terms aren't 100% the same. And how important is that difference? I don't really know. It's entirely unclear. But the implication seems strong enough that I'm going to go with it, right? So the moon presence seems to have been drawn because of this third umbilical cord to have some sort of audience with an unspecified in this description group of hunters, but it sure seems like it was Lawrence and Gehrman. Because what do we learn in the final line? We learn that became the beginning of the hunters and the hunter's dream. So this encounter that took place somehow led to the creation of the hunter's dream. Well, who's tied to the hunter's dream? Gehrman's tied to the hunter's dream. And Gehrman, we know, is the first hunter. And this is what I meant when I said I'd get into some information that isn't going to be available to us in this playthrough. Because the items that really solidify Gehrman's claim as the first hunter, we're never going to have the opportunity to get because of the nature of the ending that we're going to reach. But the information is there, right? It is solid, and I'll have put some text from the Lore Translation Guide on the screen, where we can see that very clearly Gehrman is identified as the first hunter. We know he's tied to the hunter's dream. He's the hunter's helper, as he introduces himself. And we know that he's waiting for Lawrence, right? We have that dialogue that we can get at night when he's calling out for Lawrence. And even more than that, right? As I was talking about with the doll, there seems to be some idea of Gehrman and his connection to the doll being part of the reason, maybe, why the doll is present in the Hunter's Dream in the first place, at least in the form that she's in. So Gehrman, very strongly tied to the foundation of the Hunters, right? He's the one, presumably, who built the workshop that became the model for the Hunter's Dream, the doll in the real world that became the model for the doll in the Hunter's Dream. All this stuff that seems tied to Gehrman and hunting seems to have originated what's going on with this cord. But who do we hear identified as the principal person involved with Pale Blood, the moon presence, in the research hall note? It's Lawrence. So it seems pretty clear, again, roundabout, but pretty clear, that all this association between Gehrman and the moon presence and all of this stuff, right, also has something to do with Lawrence. And that's why I sort of suggested, right, like in the previous episode, Lawrence and his associates, well, one of them almost certainly seems to have been Gehrman. So there's a little bit more information that we can get, like looking back on, again, very vague and uncertain information in this third umbilical cord. But it's important, right? Because we can, finally tie those things together. Now, I also have some mechanical information I want to get to. I also got some information, again, from the person who's been sort of most mechanical with expertise and follow-through, rhetorical. Those sort of maggot-like creatures, those parasites that jump out of the, creatures that I found, I completely forgot about that they were there in the Nightmare of Mensis. They attacked me and I was having a hard time with them. They're apparently weak to blood. But I liked how rhetorical brought up the idea that sort of seems to indicate that those enemies were sort of almost intended to be dealt with by shooting them. I like that a lot, because they're so annoying to hit with conventional weapons otherwise, that you're kind of tempted to shoot them anyway. So it's a nice almost bonus that they're weak to blood, so that if you are pumping your blood tinge, there's a set of regular enemies in the game that are normally a huge nuisance that you can just deal with, right? My build isn't set up for that, right? So that brings us back around to the idea of my build. You'll note I'm a higher level than last time. I've got my vitality up to 50. I've got my arcane up to 49. Everything's coming together. Once I get arcane to 50, this build is, essentially done, right? You can keep going, but 50 is the soft cap for everything. And arcane's a little bit of an exception because the hunter tools continue to scale, but for the most part, you get a stat to 50, and every additional point you invest in gets you just way, way, way less bang for your buck than it was getting you up to 50 in the first place. So that's the way that I've, thrown around my stat investments here as I come in on the end of the game. And I also found, I guess I don't need to go to the workshop necessarily to show this off. I also found a gem that boosts my arcane, gives me a flat arcane boost of 49. It was higher than what was the last one, 32 or something. Still not as high as it needs to be. And I did this by completing the Ease Chalice. So, made some progress, not enough, really. And yeah, the plus 49 is helpful. You can find ones that are like plus 70. This is how people get, flat arcane over 200. But I had a hard enough time finding a triangular gem that is going to get me up to even close to plus 50, plus 49 here, and forget the radials. I have had a very, very difficult time finding radial gems that do anything but physical damage in 1.00. Like fire, bolt, arcane, all of those things, I've had a really tough time finding radials that do any of those. And I don't know how tied that is to version 1.00 or not, but it's been a struggle. Anyway, I also wanted to come over here because, again, I don't really want the eye rune in the Nightmare of Mensis, because my defenses against Frenzy are super low. I must have gone past it. I specifically want to boost... Oh, and it looks like I can update my Communion rune as well. Let's see. It's just the flat deep sea rune. Yeah, here it is. Increase my frenzy resistance. And now let's get the Communion rune up to the highest level I can get here, which is going to be plus 4. That's nice. And is there a better... No, there's no better than a 10% boost for my HP. That's fine. Also, check out my frenzy meter now. That plus 200 does a huge job, right? You could see how tiny it was back when it was just the choir set that I was wearing, because the other main source of your frenzy resist is your attire. You just put on that rune and your frenzy resist shoots way, way, way high. And that's going to be very relevant for where we go next. Actually, before we go there, I almost forgot, but I was talking about hunter tools earlier. There's one that I picked up, haven't really read the description, but the one most useful time to use it in the game is coming up, and I want to cover it before I move on. So let's take a look at the tiny tonitrus. And that's a very straightforward translation. I mean, if we want to be a little bit more literal, we could just call it the small tonitrus. But, I mean, I just love the alliteration of the tiny tonitrus, and the meaning is essentially the same. So, there is that. As for the description, we have the unique trick weapon from the hand of Archibald, known among the Healing Church workshop as an eccentric, the tonitrus. Right? So this whole first two lines in this initial section here, all modifying tonitrus, toniturusu, and it's getting at the idea that you have this eccentric Archibald in the Healing Church workshop, and he's got this unique trick weapon that he's cooked up, and that's just the opening concept, the tonitrus. Now let's move on to the central section and see where it goes. Oh, interesting. So we open on what could be a little bit unclear because we have korewa, right? And I've talked before about how, like, normally when you get this referent back, you can pretty readily identify it with the item in the description name. But this time, right, because that whole opening section is all about the tonitrus, korewa could be potentially referring back to tonitrus. It's not. And that becomes clear once you keep reading and you can see sono, right, that strange, like, iron ball hammer thing, right? So clearly the second part with sono, that, is being used to describe the tonitrus, which means kore, this, right, has to be the tiny tonitrus. It's an interesting way of clarifying the referent there, right? So this, the tiny tonitrus, is of the same type as that strange iron ball mace, and is a thing which uses quicksilver bullets as a catalyst. Okay, that's the first part of the central section. Let's move on to the second line. Thrust it into the ground, and it recreates artificially the blue lightning light said to clad a dark beast. Right, so we're seeing how it's similar to the tonitrus in recreating those sparks from a dark beast, which is pretty cool. So let's move on to the final section here now. The effect of the catalyst is high, and the lightning is powerful. Right, for being very literal, the lightning light, right, the spark is powerful, but I mean, we'll see when I use this item. It sort of looks like a lightning bolt. Anyway, very final line. That is the reason it is considered Archibald's masterpiece, right? So we're getting this sort of contrasted with the tonitrus weapon itself, which people in the Healing Church workshop weren't a huge fan of. They do consider this to be a masterpiece of his, though, because it's, I guess, maximizing the effectiveness of the catalytic process of the quicksilver bullets and producing very powerful lightning sparks. Yeah, interesting sort of pairing, right? You have the tonitrus, which has its detractors, has its admirers, has its detractors, and then you have the tiny tonitrus, which is like, oh, this is his masterpiece. Like, as weird as that guy was, like, this is where it's at. Interesting that they would take that particular approach. But we're going to make use of it. Also, I think I might be able to put the blue elixir to some use as well. All right, just make sure that I've got it on my quick select bar, because otherwise it would be a nightmare to get to. All right, I'll leave the Executioner's Gloves highlighted for now. We're going to go back to the Nightmare of Mensis. Okay, that was still a lot of lore that we had to go through, but now we should be able to focus on more important things. Also, can't believe this has started already. So there is, I don't know if you can see it, I don't know if I can see it, there is a hall. It will sort of start to glow if we get a little bit closer, where if we are sort of in line of sight of that particular glow, our frenzy will just start building up. This is why I wanted my frenzy meter to be super high. But I also wanted to make use of the blue elixir, because one thing that you can do is just very quickly run straight forward. And you have all these creatures along the way that I'm hoping will quickly lose interest in me because of the nature of the blue elixir. Oh. I forgot to switch. Alright, well, that's fine. Alright, 66. Alright, because the majority of my damage is coming from the flat arcane. It makes sense. Alright. Interesting. Okay. Now, I sort of noticed in passing in the last episode, that these things didn't have the strongest resistance to just my physical attack from the rifle spear. Yeah. Okay. So even if I'm not necessarily doing the most damage with it from that perspective, that's pretty nice. Okay. I had wanted to switch my gem over to fire, but I guess I didn't get around to it. I'll come back. And you'll notice I'm now out of the range of that glowing light. So from this point forward, I can progress a little bit more naturally. Of course, we have these giant enemies again. To be a little bit careful, because there are a whole bunch of them arranged such that... If you're not careful, they can all throw rocks at you. And I really don't want to get those rocks thrown at me. Okay. This one up here I don't want to forget about. That one's going to be the harder one to deal with without getting rocks thrown at me. So I think maybe it's time I make use of another blue elixir. And we just run past all the way to the one in the back. Okay. Now it's just you and me. I feel pretty safe. Pretty secure. I don't know exactly how much the blue elixir was doing for me in that situation, but better than nothing, I think. I don't think that other one was throwing rocks at me, even if these two caught on. So, that's good. Alright, no drops for me there. Alright, now I can close in on this particular enemy. And not have to worry about any falling rocks. I mean, I do still have to worry about its attacks. But, obviously, they're not that strong a deterrent. Also, I do believe that is the bloodstone chunk I needed to finally get my rifle spear up to +9. Oh, we'll see. Right, now there are some items that I missed out on because I ran past that group of enemies, like, concentrated on the bridge. So, I am going to have to go back into that area at some point. However, I'm thinking that point is not now, because we're going to sort of loop back onto that part of the area after we go a little bit further in here. And so my advanced knowledge of that allows me to not mind so much that I have to keep going here. Alright, now this is where I'm going to want the tiny tonitrus. Just make some blood bullets ahead of time here. Okay. Also, I think... yeah, there's an item out here. Take that high-level cold blood. And there's individual spiders that I can draw to me here. I think there's one more individual spider that I can draw to me. Let's see. Maybe 2? Yeah, there's 2 up here. Oh, they fell. Okay. Well, as long as they come over this way. Oh, I couldn't quite kill them both. That's okay. I'm a little torn on whether or not to heal. Actually, no, I'm not. Because I need more blood bullets. I want to have them at 5. Okay. Now, I can come out here, and we can get the one really good use of the tiny tonitrus in the game, because I have it, and it's really good at traveling in straight lines, which is exactly what all these spiders are doing as they come at me through this door. But as you saw, the quicksilver bullet consumption is not nothing, right? As effective as a catalyst as it may be. I wonder. Maybe one shot of the tiny tonitrus. Yeah, definitely more worth it than the other option there. Okay. And now the giant spider should be dead. Uh-oh. Say as it dodges my last hit. Alright, now the giant spider should be out of commission here. Good. And we'll get some of those bullets back, although not as many as I would like. That's okay. Alright, we're going to switch back to the executioner's gloves here. Slightly more valuable. Even though the fact that they're 1.00 version means they don't track as well as they do in later versions of this game, I think they're still going to be a little bit more useful to me in comparison with the other option. And now I'm just going to, take a little bit of a breather. Got to gather my courage because I know, I know if I go through that doorway and have a little bit of a challenging fight on my hands, and I want my HP to be at full, and I've already got blood bullets. Okay, here we go. I lose this fight, I think, maybe 50% of the time? We'll see what happens. Oh boy. So this hunter here has a nameplate. This is... You see that, Rose Marinus? That's the giveaway. This is Choir Intelligencer Edward. Or something to that effect. Choir Intelligencer is the important part. So this seems to be a spy sent by the choir to infiltrate Mensis. Whew! And I won. That can be a very difficult fight. Got those sedatives, too. Calming effects for those who delve too deeply into the arcane. And of course the idea is that's supposed to be a spy, right? So they don't really know, I guess, that the choir, the agency that they would be reporting to, is no more. Very unclear, very sort of hazy story thing, because I don't even know where the nameplate Choir Intelligencer Edgar comes from, or Edward, or whatever. I don't know the actual name. Choir Intelligencer, like I said, that's the key part. But yeah, I don't know. I'll have to look that up, like when I'm editing. I can find out where that came from. But it's an important piece of information because it does give us that idea, right? Remember I was talking about how there's a member of the choir who might have left the note about how Master Willem was right? Might have been that person. Because they're in the choir, and the choir thinks Master Willem was right. I kind of prefer the idea that it's the leader of Mensis who has that revelation. I think that's a little bit of a more attractive story to me. But, I mean, it's not exactly clear. Like I was saying, I don't even necessarily know where that nameplate gets shown off or comes from. So, very, very interesting feature of the game if you have to rely on potentially supplementary information, sort of like the other enemy names, right? All come from things like art books and official guides and things. Anyway, These enemies can be a problem if you're relying on physical damage. So I'm sort of glad to have the access to bolt here. And this out here, this elevator is the key to why I was saying we'd sort of be circling back. Because it may not look like it right now, but we have actually returned. That's the bridge over there that I just rushed across. And then up there in that tower, I believe, is where we can get frenzied if we see the light. Let's demonstrate that eventually. I was going to demonstrate it just now, but I did not want to get drawn into a fight while I was also potentially going to get frenzied to death. So why don't you just come over this way, friend? Step away from that edge. Step away from this edge, too, for that matter. Just come... Step away from that edge 3. Just come all the way back here, where there's a good solid outcropping. And then we can do battle. Particularly because that way all your friends are behind a giant boulder, and they can't throw rocks at me. Uh-huh. There we go. That's that character dealt with. Oh. One has noticed me, but not the other. Okay. There's the light, which is sticking these frenzy spears into me and draining my HP like crazy. Boy, thank goodness that my, thank goodness that my frenzy build-up meter is so bolstered by that rune. Uh-oh. I meant for that to be an attack. And you can see the other one is tossing those boulders at me. But I'm making good use of the protection of that rock. A little outcropping prevents the other thrown rock from reaching me. Okay. Now let's potentially expose ourselves to danger once again. Uh-oh. I was really hoping... Alright. Alright. HP. Come back, please. The frenzy, like, directly draining your HP is the scariest thing. Look at it go. Right? I'm not frenzied. It's just the buildup or something is driving my HP down, even as my meter goes up. And if that meter ever fills, you know, the boom, instant loss to 70% of your HP. The combination of those two things, the fact that that particular source of frenzy is just, like, constantly draining your HP in addition to exposing you to that 70% burst, like, that is a combination for instant death. That's what that is. So we gotta really book it here. I don't think there are other, like, useful items along this particular path. Boy, there could be. Alright, this brings me back to those other items that I did know about. You know, I'm curious. How does the... Uh-oh. Okay, only 30 damage there. Yikes. I get away from the frenzy effect. Oh, you're doing fire from your torch there. I guess it used the bolt effect on me before. Alright, 43. The fun thing is the enemies can totally get affected by that frenzy. This is a problem. Okay. And now, uh-oh. Uh-oh. Stop. Frenzy, stop, please. Oh, I have the wrong weapon out. Boy, this rifle spear, for whatever reason, is really good at dealing with these parasites. Whew. Okay. That was a radial bolt? Holy smokes! Oh, maybe I gotta farm these guys. Wow. Where even am I? My frenzy meter is, as powerful as it is, it's gonna get filled. Stop! Stop! Unbelievable. Will this be the end? No. Thank goodness. Okay, I'm going to cut forward to when this meter has, like, depleted a healthy amount, and then I'll move on again. Okay. We got the frenzy back under control, which means I can now run out and grab this item here. Oh, it's just some blood vials. I mean, granted, I needed them. But, okay. Alright, I'm just going to ignore these things. And that was some sort of Kyoka effect, which I don't need. Okay. Alright. I'm going to make... I don't like how high that frenzy bar is. I'm going to wait just a little bit, and then I'm going to run for it and head back to... Wait a minute. Head back to the Hunter's Dream. However, is that a tree or is that a ship's mast? I'm still trying to pinpoint where exactly is the best place to get a look at those ships. Because they're out there, I tell you. They're real. The ships are real. It's an important piece of visual information that ties this to the Nightmare Frontier and potentially suggests the idea of a unified Nightmare realm. You remember how I was talking ages ago about how I'm intrigued by the concept of the Nightmare? With, like, individual, like, places that are shaped out of that unified Nightmare realm? I find that intriguing. And the idea that the Nightmare of Mensis and the Nightmare Frontier can be tied visually by those ship's masts, like, goes really far towards being able to, like, bring that idea together where otherwise it would be pretty suspect. I just can't tell. I'm going to have to, like, look this up between episodes or something because I do want to demonstrate this. I'm just not convinced that I've found the right way to do it. Alright, anyway, I'm going to run, having established this, like, circle that will allow us to access the, like, granted still large, but final portion of the Nightmare of Mensis. I'm going to head back to the first... Oh, I thought the lamp was behind there. It's not. I'm going to head back to the first lamp and head back to the dream. Okay. Well, that was quite an adventure. Next time, I'm going to pick things up. We'll begin our journey up and down, really, the loft area in the Nightmare of Mensis, as we've dealt with that sort of first section, that circular loop that grants us access to sort of the main tower. It'll be interesting to continue to make forward progress through the game. I'm very curious also to just continue to check out some of the things that I've gained access to. Looks like I finally have a radial version of a bolts gem that I could use for something. That's very exciting. So I'm going to be checking out some mechanical options for my current setup and maybe do a little bit of chalice dungeoneering. Try. If I can really boost my damage, maybe I'll finally be able to break through what's going on the hard wall that has become the watchdog of the old lords in the defiled chalice. We'll see. Anyway, we'll see. I'll keep you updated as to how all that ends up going. In the meantime, I'm going to call an end to my hunt for the evening. I hope that you've enjoyed this, and as always, I would call for any comments that you'd like to share, any feedback you have for this playthrough, any of your own lore theories that you'd like to explain, anything that you think I got wrong. I'd love to hear from you. But, you know, like I said, I'm going to call an end to my hunt for the evening for now, but I wish all of you good hunting.